Welcome to hashmarx Fantasy Update. I'm Jane Sherman, and today's theme is risk. When banks hand out bonuses to their individual business units, they don't do it based solely on profits. At first, it may seem like a good idea to hand out the largest bonuses to the guys who make the most money. But that creates a messed up incentive where business units try to make as much money as possible and then in the process end up taking on really risky endeavors. So in order to prevent this, banks give bonuses to their business units based on a ratio between the return or the profit that they make divided by the risk that they took. So the banker gets penalized for taking on more risk. And in this way, the incentive becomes to try to get as much return or profit as possible while minimizing the amount of risk. In finance, risk is the most important thing to manage. But in fantasy football, risk is a critical dimension that gets constantly overlooked to the detriment of most fantasy team managers. For example, every year there are a bunch of guys in the beginning of the season that do exceptionally well for a week or two. And when you check out the free agency, you'll see these guys at the very top of the list and pick them up. And in fact, in auction drafts, people will spend a large portion of their entire allocated season money, auction dollars, on these pickups. But the problem with a lot of these guys is that their performance is totally unlikely to repeat. Even though it may look like they have a high average score for the season, they're actually really risky calls. So let's examine an example from last season, 2013. In week 1, Jerome Simpson got 32 fantasy points, which put him as the 7th ranked wide receiver that week and at the top of most free agency lists. However, that stellar performance never repeated. In fact, he was in the single digits for most of the rest of the year. Still, for the next 3 weeks, he looked like a high scorer due to his high average and was at the top of free agency. But if you ever thought of picking him up, you would need to take the dimension of risk into account and realize that a consistent performance with a smaller average would make a much better pickup choice. To quantify this phenomenon, we created the hashmarx risk score on a 100-point scale, with the high score being good and thus indicating less risk. The risk score measures the consistency of the player's fantasy points week over week and penalizes underperforming. We define underperforming to mean dipping below the hashmarx position index, which is a benchmark for how many points an average starting fantasy player should get at that position. The more often and the more severely a player dips below the index, the riskier the player, and hence the lower their risk score will be. If a player always performs above the index, then they receive a perfect score of 100. Eagles running back LeSean McCoy had the highest risk score at the end of last season with a 97,